Welcome to the Customer Machine Podcast, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston and Yoav Ezer. Glenn is a psychologist and marketer whose companies have sold more than $30 million in consulting and has trained thousands of marketers across different niches and industries. Yoav is a programmer turned marketer whose companies have sold over $5 million in products and services. Together, they'll teach you how to systematically stand out, attract, and convert the best customers, even in brutally competitive markets. And now, here's Glenn and Yoav.
Okay, well, this is Dr. Glenn Livingston with the Customer Machine, and I'm here with my partner, Yoav Ezer. How are you, Yoav?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Glenn.
Terrific. Now, we are here with one of the world's foremost A-list copywriters, David Deutsch, who really needs no introduction. But I was actually very excited to talk to David about some of the latest things that he's been working on, in particular how a story relates to writing copy, but not in the traditional sense. So, David, welcome. How are you today?
I'm great, Glenn. Glad to be here.
I really appreciate you joining us. Well, why don't we dive right in? So,
Okay.
Just before the interview, I sent you kind of a big outline with all these fancy schmancy copywriting questions that I wanted to talk to you about, and you wrote me back that, well, you're really working on something interesting these days having to do with story. Could you just kind of give us a background about what that is and what you're doing with it?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to do that, although it's still kind of formulating in my head. Basically everyone talks about story, about telling stories. Everyone knows stories are good. Everyone knows we're hardwired for story, and stories have 3 acts and the hero's journey and all those kinds of things. But I think an underexplored aspect of story is the stories that people tell themselves. What's in our prospect's head while he's reading something. And there's always a story. I mean, we live by stories. We understand the world through a story. We understand our own lives through the story of our lives as we tell it to ourselves. There's even, as you probably know, a branch of psychological therapy called like story therapy or narrative therapy, where you try to find what those stories are and you change them in order to help people with their psychological problems. So someone has a story of, oh, the world is against me, or, I'm not a good person, or whatever. By changing that story, you change that person in a very profound way. So I've been kind of exploring how that relates to what we do, to marketing, how our prospects have certain stories that they tell themselves about things. Maybe this is possible, this is not possible, this company is a certain kind of company, whatever it is. They've got stories about your company, stories about you, stories about the product, and most of all stories about how they do or don't fit in to what you're trying to sell them, what you're trying to convince them to do. And so a lot of people, I think, make the mistake of just kind of telling a story. I've got a story to tell. This is how I started my company. This is the story of Jim. He used my product, and look at Jim today. And they do that without really considering what's the story going through the head of the prospect, which may well be a different kind of story. May well be a story of, I don't see how this could work for me, or a story of, it's not believable, or even just a story of just great skepticism. And so by resonating with the story that your customer already has, your prospect already has, by entering that story and by influencing that story with facts, with stories, with reframes, I think your copy can then go to a much deeper level than if you merely become a good storyteller.
How do you detect that story? How do you figure that out?
A lot of ways, I think, by talking to people, by talking to prospects, because if you really listen to what people are telling you, even listening on forums is a form of listening. you start to see that what they say is based on a very specific story of how the world is and how the segment of their world that you're concerned with is, whether that's their health, whether that's how they invest. You know, you talk to someone and you see they have a picture of the world, the investment world, as being a very risky place. The health world, maybe they have a view of medicine as being doctors are God, and alternative medicine is, you know, is a scam, snake oil, or maybe they have an affinity for alternative medicine. So it kind of overlaps with the whole idea of knowing your prospect, but in a much deeper way, in terms of what are they telling themselves? What's really their view of the world that comes out as, you know, the opinions that they're giving you. It's almost like you're reverse engineering their worldview from their opinions. If that makes sense.
So if we were to discover that the prospect story was that, you know, the medical model is really the authority, doctors are God, and alternative medicine is snake oil, but your goal was to sell some type of an alternative supplement. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's where you kind of enter the story, and you know, maybe you talk about, maybe it's the story of a doctor who was a very traditional doctor, but one day he had a case of something that he couldn't cure, and in doing some research he found a study which showed that a certain alternative methodology had cured it, and he skeptically decided to give that a try with this patient because he had nothing to lose, and he found that that cured the patient, and so that took him on his own journey through the world of alternative medicine, and he found that there really was a valid place for it.
Got it.
So as you go on that journey, or as the skeptical prospect goes on that journey with the doctor, his story maybe starts to change. He can maybe see himself in that doctor's place. Like, yeah, I'm skeptical, but if I saw something like that, I suppose I could be open to, you know, alternative medicine.
Interesting. So you really have to meet them where their basic assumptions are and start there, rather than trying to hammer them over the head about, you know, the science behind this alternative approach or anything like that, because that's your story, that's not their story.
Yeah. You know, I think you see that, yeah, exactly, and I think you see that most clearly maybe at what we call the margins, you know, at the extremes. Like you take Trump and Clinton. You know, I'm not going to get into politics, but you could see that people who support Trump has a very specific story of how the world is, right? People who support Hillary have a very specific story of how the world is. You know, when it comes to even something like terrorism, you know, the United States has a very specific story of America and what we stand for, and independence, and a sort of cowboy way of looking at things. And Islamic extremists have a way of looking at the world of, you know, we've been attacked and occupied for all these years in the Crusades, and their story is of 2,000 years of occupation and being pushed around. And so they see the United States as the new Crusaders. And until we understand their story that they're telling themselves, the people even of the Middle East are telling themselves there, all are saying, you're wrong, you're doing the wrong thing, why are you killing people, why are you doing this, why are you blowing up things, why are you supporting, you know, this, doesn't really get through to them. We have to start with, you know, what their story is and show that it's not the next crusade. That's not what we're trying to do. But if we don't understand that that's how they're viewing the world, you know, then it's going to be very frustrating. And there are, part of how I discovered this is actually people in the Defense Department that are kind of, you know, that study this sort of thing of how do you communicate, How do how do we deal with being in the Middle East and communicating to the population?
Are there other, this is fascinating, by the way, and I'm wondering if there are other examples of stories you might have detected in a market and how, how you'd seen maybe some of your competitors try to go about things that didn't quite resonate, but understanding the story, you were able to take a more direct path. What is that a question you can answer?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things, I think. End of America, which was a very well-known video sales letter for Agora, resonated, I think, with the story that a lot of people have of kind of all good things come to an end. There's likely to be another crash. Crashes happen every so often. There's a lot of things in the world that are kind of pointing to something bad happening to the dollar. The crash of the dollar is, a story that a lot of people have in their minds. They see the dollar being worth less and less. And so End of America was hugely successful, I think largely because it resonated with that story that people already had. They were ready to kind of think about the end of America. And it wasn't really the end of America like flames shooting up and everything like that. It was really the story that's been told before of the end of the dollar and the crash of the dollar, the devaluation of the dollar, and just very reasonably went on to explain how to protect yourself and even profit from what's coming.
Gotcha.
There was also a very famous health promotion from Arthur Johnson, which was the headline for it was "Had Enough," and it was coffee is actually good for you. Drinking a lot of water is a lot of baloney. You're doing all these things you don't have to be doing, and it really resonated, I think, with the story that a lot of people had, which was I'm sick of doing these things. I avoid this and I still get sick, or it just makes my life miserable, and that had enough, and the counterintuitive kinds of things that he went on to explain really resonated with not just the story that they had, but the story that they wanted to be in, which was a world where you don't have to do these things.
Are there ever times when you're exploring, trying to find out what the story is, where you just feel like you can't resonate, you can't pick it up? Like maybe there's something about your own ideas that you're holding on to too tightly, or do you find that if you spend enough time researching the market and talking to prospects, that the story is always there?
Yeah, I would say the story is always there. And if it's not, then you take the facts, opinions, evidence that you have and kind of use your imagination, kind of like method acting, to kind of imagine what the story is that a person would have.
Okay.
That believes these things, that has these opinions, that buys these products, that behaves in the way we know they behave from a psychodemographic, viewpoint.
Did you ever read a book called 20 Master Plots?
Yeah.
And for the audience, the premise is that almost all of literature could be boiled down into these 20 different themes. The revenge theme, the grief theme, the underdog theme, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's a wonderful book and goes through a lot of examples. Does that help you to kind of put together what the story might be? Can you relate the idea of those archetypical underlying stories to the stories that you're detecting?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's in the same way. There are probably 20 plots that people have in terms of stories about, maybe the Uber story of the mega story of their own lives, and the more micro stories, the more micro narratives that they have for specific kinds of things. And maybe that's, a skepticism narrative, or maybe it's a negativity narrative, or maybe it's a, total acceptance kind of a narrative. Maybe it's a hero narrative where they want to see themselves coming into the situation as a hero. And, that's a lot of times, I think that's a big part of the role that people want to see themselves.
Gotcha.
Is to be the hero.
I have one more question on this theme, and then I'm going to let you ask a couple of things. And this might seem like an odd question, David, but how has it changed you as a person to have had this realization about story in your work?
Well, I think it's changed me as a person because I realize that I have my own stories. I have a story that writing is hard. I have a story that, I have stories about my life. I have a story of how I got to where I am. I have a story of what caused that. I have a story of what's possible, what I can do and what I can't do. And when I think of that in terms of a story, it enables me to go in and change the narrative of that story.
Yeah. So it's actually kind of exciting when you can identify the story that you're living in, because especially as a writer, you realize that you can change the narrative. You can actually change your life once you realize what story you're living in.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you can see it so much more clearly, of course, in other people than in oneself, of how many people just don't do things because it doesn't fit into their story of who they are and what they do. So someone will say, I don't go camping. I don't do that. When in reality, if they did it, they would, they may likely enjoy it. Or I can't dance, so I'm not going to dance.
I don't eat vegetables.
Yeah, I don't eat vegetables.
You usually have a whole bunch of questions stored up by this point. Do you want to come in with a couple of things?
Just one at this point. What happens if you detect more than one powerful story in the market? Let's go back
yeah.
to politics. Right now, if you look at both sides, they're both sure that if, the Trump people, they're sure that if Hillary gets to power, America is going to end, and vice versa.
Right.
So, totally competing stories. How do you use both stories, or which one do you use?
Well, I think most of the time you're writing to one or the other audience in a certain way, at least with a lot of things that I do. The investment stuff that I do tends to be more toward the Hillary audience. More toward the Trump kind of way of looking at things. For health, it's probably a mix. So I would pretty much avoid politics in the sense of taking a different side or resonating with that side. I would try to find a deeper narrative that could be agreed upon, and that doesn't depend on which candidate they support or which story they have about the candidates or about politics, but stories about more that they're investing or their health or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that it's almost like when you're working with a patient, most people know I'm also a psychologist, and when you're working with a patient that presents you with a whole series of narratives, your job is to really zero in on what the primary theme is. And in part that has to do with what they present first, because if you think about it, if someone is both hungry and thirsty, if they ask you for food first, they're probably more hungry than they are thirsty. If they ask you for water first, they're probably more thirsty than they are hungry. And our thoughts are not unlike that. So if you are interviewing a prospect and the first thing that they want to talk to you about has to do with, that the medical model is really paramount and doctors are God and all alternative health is really just a bunch of snake oil. And then later on they're talking about Trump should really build the wall. We got to keep those Mexicans out, and they're ruining the country. In that case, that wouldn't be the only clue that I would use, but the primacy and and then the emotion with which each one of those things was presented would influence me to lean towards the the doctor is a god theme. And then I also kind of think of it like you don't have to just talk about one. The prospect is giving you clues about their whole personality, but it's like if you're composing a song, there's going to be there's going to be an underlying chord that really forms the root, but then you're going to have to move a little bit away from that and have a melody or a transition at some point. So it's not really one or the other. It's which one is more primal, and where do you focus? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I kind of like to throw in things as the bridge. It's like you've got the main shtick, and then you've got the bridge, which can be a whole different kind of a thing. But I love the music analogy because it's kind of like it also, of course, is the product. And so you have to consider which of their stories can I resonate with in a way that will be helpful to my selling my product or service, getting this person to act in the way that is in their interests and my interest for them to act. And sometimes that's just kind of this, what goes well together, what harmonizes together, what I can make into a harmonious, melodious, effective promotion. Like this all fits together, resonating with this story.
And so when you're looking for the big idea, because I know that copywriters really have to look for, the big idea, the hook. Does that grow out of the story that you found, or are you looking for the big idea someplace else?
Well, I think it can be either way, not to kind of cop out, but I think the big idea can come from, it should certainly resonate with their story and harmonize and go well with it. But I think it can either grow out of it or not grow out of it. It can either relate very strongly to it or not relate very strongly to it. The thing about had enough, that the whole big idea of that grew out of, this story of I don't want to be doing this stuff anymore. I'm tired of it. Whereas you might have something that says, hey, this herb can cure arthritis. And that doesn't really have to do with the story, but how you convince them, how you prove to them that this herb can cure arthritis had better resonate with their story and how they view things.
I see. Is there any other advice that you could give us about where to find the big idea? I know one place, for example, that I'm a very systematic thinker. I was kind of trained as a scientist practitioner, and I don't read enough fiction. And I know that because of that, in some ways, my big ideas for copy are, for lack of a better word, sometimes a little dry. And it's only recently that I tried to correct that, and I'm wondering, do you recommend that copywriters read fiction, or is there something else that they need to do to train their brains to find those big emotional ideas that could lead into the story or resonate with the story? Help me out with the big idea, David. How would I do that?
Sure. Yeah, I think reading fiction is a good way to do that. Maybe a more direct way to train oneself, I think, is to look at great promotions and kind of reverse engineer, deconstruct, forensically look at them and see what is the big idea and how did they arrive at that big idea. Where did that big idea come from? How many types of big ideas are there? You can kind of categorize big idea. Like if you're working in the health market, let's say, certain big ideas come from, the cure itself, it's found in the Amazon jungle. It was discovered by a medicine man and some doctor who made a trip there. Or it grows in Siberia. Some big ideas come from the market itself, like had enough. Or, if you've tried everything. Or, and then some big ideas come from, I had a package once, how to cure any disease by taking advantage of its hidden weakness. And it was a big idea that came from a way of grouping together the cures, a way of looking at healing by saying, look, a lot of these cures work because they take advantage of a hidden weakness. Like for instance, cancer loves sugar. So one of the best alternative cures for cancer is a way of depriving it of the sugar that it loves by kind of starving it to death.
So if you can look at the problem and try to categorize it using some paradigm that hasn't really been talked about, then that's kind of interesting because it helps people to, the way that the brain works, we're always trying to kind of re-sort and jiggle around our memories and thoughts and see if there's a better paradigm to organize them with. And so it gives people a sense of mastering their environment when you can present that. So I find it really interesting, the idea of trying to look at the problem in a new way and give people some new way to organize their environment like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very big on kind of systematizing things, categorizing things, because that helps me to be able to look at the different categories in terms of generating an idea. So, if you look at promotions and you see there are 5 types of big ideas, and within these 5 types there are 3 subtypes, then whenever you want a big idea, you could just go through the 5 types and 3 subtypes and see, how might I use this? How might I use type 1, subtype 3 for this particular promotion that I'm trying to do?
Cool.
Or, look at something like, End of America, right? See, the big idea there is a kind of a future, bad thing happening. It's kind of a prediction big idea. So I'm doing something for arthritis. How can I take that same kind of template and use it? Is it the end of arthritis, for instance? How this cure is going to mean that arthritis in the future won't be the problem that it once was.
Cool.
Okay.
Yoav, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. So what's the most practical way, in your experience, to understand the story? What would you do? I want to understand the story. What's my next move?
I would say you really just have to immerse yourself in their world, in the world of your market. The best way is really by talking to someone who is part of the market. And in talking to them, asking them questions, questions that cover the whole gamut of their experience from how did you get started, then what happened, what's happening now, what do you see happening in the future, trying to find their viewpoint, not just about your product, but about the whole broad space that product lives in, how that product affects their lives. You start to see that they have certain assumptions, and that those assumptions come from an underlying story of how things are, how they fit into there. And beyond talking, then you have, there are places where you can see, okay, where do they talk? They talk in forums. They talk in, is there writing on the internet that people have done? There's writing on the internet now about what's it like to have arthritis? What is it really like to have Crohn's disease? You can find out a lot of stuff like that. People have written about investing and what was it like to lose a lot of money or to make a lot of money.
I think there's some markets where it also makes a sense to go observe people. There are some things you can learn which you can't learn by talking. You know, like when I was teaching, I built a product on alpacas about how to get into the alpaca business. This is before the market crashed. And we interviewed a lot of alpaca ranchers, and we talked to alpaca specialists in the accounting field. But when I really felt like I got it was when I started visiting the alpaca farms, and I saw how the women in particular would go right up to the alpacas and kind of look in the eye and kiss them, and I could just really grab that emotional attachment. And while the women were doing that, the men were going over the books. And then I really understood that the men needed more of the accounting information, and the women I had to hit them hard with how it was almost like having a baby.
Right.
Yeah, but I think there's something about observational learning that you don't always get from talking to people.
Well, that's interesting because, what we're talking about is story, and story is those details, the women kissing the llamas and the men in the back doing the books. It's the smell of the llama farm. That sensory detail is a big part of storytelling. A lot of times, I work with a lot of writers, and a lot of times what I basically tell them is think of it like you're writing a screenplay. Stop thinking of it like you're writing copy and just putting words on a page. But be a screenwriter, bring images to the page. Let me see people doing things.
Show me what they smell like, right?
Yeah, show me what they smell like.
No, seriously. You want the picture to be that vivid, and you need to be building towards towards a high point and then a resolution and a denouement.
Well, you know the research too, probably as well as I do, in terms of when people experience something with that level of sensory detail, in a story, in words, it's pretty much the same as if they actually experienced it in real life. It fires the same neurons. It does the same things in the brain.
Yeah. Yoav, did you have more questions?
Yes, a lot of them actually. So how long would you recommend someone immerses himself in the market before he really gets a sense of the story?
Gosh, I don't think you can do that too much. Gary Halbert used to spend weeks. Partly it was immersing, partly it was just thinking, putting himself in the shoes of the market. So copy is really not that hard to write if you're ready to write it. I think the problem is that people start writing too soon, and they're thinking things through as they write. They haven't thought it through beforehand. They haven't got the pitch down.
So sometimes I say that I'm not really ready to write the copy until I feel like the market has changed me as a person. If I just feel like I've connected to those people so deeply, and I really, like in the alpaca example, I understand that this is really the woman's dream. Usually her children are just about grown, and she's looking for, like, she's a mom with more love to give. And I have these stories in my head of, Emma and Ethel and Sally, who, looked at me and told me how much they miss their kids, but now they've got their alpacas. And I just feel like those people have become a part of me, and I understand that human experience, and it's in some small way has changed me as a person. Then I'm ready to write the copy for real. Yeah. And I wish I could say I always took my own advice like that, David, because as you're describing it, like I'm actually in the middle of writing another letter which I'm finding hard to write, and I realize that I probably haven't lived in the market long enough yet, so I'm trying to think it through as I'm writing it, as opposed to accepting that I have to wait until the market changes me first, to immerse myself a little more, wait until the market changes me first.
Gosh, I feel like I could write that alpaca letter just from talking to you about it. Like that deep understanding like that, you know, and that's what you almost want to get to. And I think that's what you're calling changing. It's like you break through the surface, you know. You understand that people with arthritis are, you know, are always afraid to like open a jar because it's going to hurt their hand. They're afraid to shake, you know, if you have arthritis in your wrist, you're afraid to shake hands. You're afraid to pick up your grandchildren. You know, that's the level that you want to get to. You know, when people are overweight. I mean, we've talked about this, I think, with your promotion.
You helped me with that, yeah. Yeah.
When people are overweight, you know, the guilt that they feel, the feeling that they're always being judged, you know, whether they're eating a salad or they're eating a big bowl of spaghetti, they feel like people are judging them.
Or if they're on an airplane and they have to ask for an extra seat extender.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And even if they don't, do they feel like they're taking up too much space? Is this person next to me annoyed, you know, because there's an overweight person next to them and I'm taking up a little bit of their space, you know?
And you have to let those people get inside of you. You have to let those people and those stories get inside of you before you can write.
Yeah, yeah. I always remember one of the people I've worked with a lot is Jim Punkery, who's a great, great writer, not very well known, and was a creative director at Rodale for years. And I remember meeting him for the first time, and I was so excited. I'm going to meet Jim Punkery, great, you know, legendary Jim Punkery, and he's going to tell me all his secrets and all his techniques for writing and all this cool stuff. And all he wanted to talk about was the market. He only wanted to talk about the people and what they felt and their feelings, and is the market moving this way or that way, and do you think that they're still concerned about this? And I was kind of disappointed until I realized that that's the essence of what makes great writing, is really understanding the market in a deep, deep way. Then the writing is easy. Then you don't need all these, I mean, yeah, the techniques and the little, you know, tricks and do this, don't do that are very helpful. But it's got to come from that place of understanding. And even compassion, as you said, it changes you, you know. You start to feel for people that have arthritis or that, you know, want to have alpacas because they miss their kids or, you know, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yoav, we have just a couple more minutes. Do you want to ask another question or two, and then we should give David some time to tell us how people can get more from him?
One last question then. So how do you practice writing good stories? How does one go about practicing this?
You know, I think if you really want to get good at story, then you've got to do something I learned from John Carlton, which is like to tell stories. You know, if you go to have lunch, if you go out for lunch and come back, can you come back with a story? You know, and if you go with that in mind, then you could see, oh, I had this interesting encounter with the waitress. You know, oh, this interesting thing happened while I was driving. I noticed this about this strange thing happened with this kid and the food at the next table. And you start to learn, and maybe you study a little bit about story and about this idea of 3 acts, beginning, middle, and an end, this idea of conflict, this idea of something being at stake. And more you try to integrate that into the way you tell stories. Oh, this kid at the next table, you know, his mother wanted him to behave and sit down, but he wouldn't. He wanted to do this, so now there's conflict, you know, and the people at the next table were getting really annoyed. Oh, now there's something at stake, right? And you start to think in terms of story. You know, you ever know people that are just really interesting storytellers, and they always seem to have a story. Whatever happens to them, they have a story about it. It's not because interesting things happen to them and not to us. It's because they're looking for stories. It's because they're oriented towards story.
The other thing that I think is that the mistake people make when they're looking for stories to use in their marketing is they've got their relevance filter on too early. And I think what you need to do is look for things that move you emotionally. And I really like what you're saying, David, about, you know, learn the structure of story. In a story, we know something about a story is a beginning, middle, and an end. We know something about what the characters are thinking, feeling, and doing. And then practice telling stories from that perspective. In any case, David, would you like to tell our listeners if they wanted a little bit more about what you do or how you can help them? Where would they go? What would you have to offer? That kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they can go to my website where they could get in touch with me. There's some, my creativity course is there, but I've been a little lax about really selling that. I'm not sure. I don't think the links work. So if anyone is interested in it, they're welcome to just get in touch with me through the contact form at the website.
Okay.
There's also a free book, a free report, A to Z, copywriting from A to Z, which they can get there for free. So it's a good place to go, and it's davidldeutsch.com.
And spell your last name for them.
I will. It's David, and then L as in Lee, and then Deutsch, DEUTSCH.
And I would say one of the best reasons to go over to David's site and take a look at what he has to offer is that David is not someone who really makes his primary business selling all these products and services that teach. He's a guy that is walking the walk and, writing the copy and, working with some of the top companies in the world to do that. And so the time that he does take to develop some products and to gracefully teach what he has to offer is something that we should all benefit from as much as we can. So, Yoav, do you have any final questions or parting thoughts?
No, thank you, David.
Oh, you're welcome. I would just say one thing I wanted to say too, Glenn, is I'm not really writing so much anymore. I'm doing some writing, but mainly I'm helping other people write, which I find that I enjoy much more than writing in a certain way. Although if I do it long enough, I start to get like, I want to write something myself now. But I've been working through companies with their in-house writers and their freelance writers. I've been working directly with writers just to get their copy from up a few notches. B-level writers that want to be A-level writers, A-level writers that want to be better, companies that want to, get better copy from the writers they work with. So I just find that I'd rather make 10 pieces of copy better than, do one piece of copy myself.
Interesting.
So,
interesting.
Yeah, leverage and all that, I guess.
Cool.
And also I get bored easily, so this way I just learn about 10 cool things instead of one thing,
Yeah, right.
Okay. Well, David, thank you very much. I don't want to keep you longer than we promised.
Thanks for your time and attention. For more information about the products and services we offer to help dramatically grow your business, please visit thecustomermachine.com. On behalf of Glenn and Yoav, thanks for listening.